Okay.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course U.S. History, and today, after last week's bummer on slavery, we turn to a happier topic: the rise of democratization in the U.S. This was also known as the Age of Jackson. No, Stan, not that Jackson. No, Stan, come on, seriously. No. Yes, that Jackson, Andrew Jackson. Sorry, I just had to check my collar. Right, so you'll recall that the initial democracy of the United States wasn't terribly democratic. Almost all voters were white, male landowners. Mr. Green, that's just radically unfair. Exactly, me from the past, but between 1820 and 1850, this started to change. State legislatures lowered or else eliminated the property qualifications for voting, which allowed many more people to vote so long as they were, both white and male. Mr. Green! So I'd be in, right? Yeah, that seems reasonable. Yeah, me from the past. Quick privilege check. One of the reasons we study history is so that you can learn that people like you are not actually at the center of history, even though, you've been taught that. But anyway, the whole idea of owning land as a prerequisite for voting is sort of Jeffersonian. An individual who works his own land can be truly independent because he doesn't need to rely upon markets to acquire stuff or, God forbid, wages to give him money with which to buy stuff. No, he makes his own stuff, and he doesn't need anybody except for slaves and also women to make shoes and clothes and to cook food and also make children. But in light of the market revolution, the idea of excluding wage workers seemed very outdated. The idea of excluding women and non-white people, though, still quite popular. But this defining characteristic of the Age of Jackson really had very little to do with Andrew Jackson himself, because by the time he became president in 1829, every state except for North Carolina, Virginia, and Rhode Island had already gotten rid of their property requirements. In fact, that's probably why he got elected. Right, so you recall that America's mostly fake victory in the war of 1812 and the subsequent collapse of the Federalist Party ushered in the era of good feelings, which was another way of saying that there was basic agreement on most domestic policies. The American system was a program of economic nationalism built on, 1, federally financed internal improvements like roads and canals, what we would now call infrastructure, 2, tariffs to protect new factories and industries, and 3, a national bank that would replace the first Bank of the United States, whose charter expired in 1811. You'll never guess what we called this second bank, unless you guess that we called it the Second Bank of the United States. The main supporters of this American system were our old friend John C. Calhoun and our new friend Henry Clay. Both were Jeffersonian Republicans, which isn't surprising because that was the only political party, but it's kind of surprising because the American system had nothing to do with the agrarian republic that Jefferson had championed. But whatever, this was the era of good feelings, so we're gonna go with it. By the way, this nationalism also extended to foreign affairs. After Latin America won its independence from Spain, President Monroe made a speech proposing that Europe shouldn't try to retake colonies in the Western Hemisphere. And if they did, we would, do stuff. This so-called Monroe Doctrine also said that the U.S. would stay out of European wars. Ha 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 ha, that is hilarious! But we did live up to the other end of it. You'll remember that when the British came for the Falkland Islands, we were like, this shall not stand! Just kidding, we were like, go ahead. Right, so the last era of good feelings president was John Quincy Adams, who was quite the diplomat and expansionist. He actually wrote the Monroe Doctrine, for instance. But in fact, it turns out that all feelings were not good. There was significant disagreement over 3 main issues. First, many people felt that the federal government shouldn't invest in infrastructure. Like James Madison, who'd initially supported those bills, ended up vetoing one of them that included a big spending increase to finance roads and canals. Now, the roads and canals did get built, but in the end, most of the financing fell to the states. There were also big problems with the Second Bank of the United States, which, is why you cannot visit a branch of it these days, but we'll get to that in a minute. And lastly, there was the perennial issue of slavery. In this case, the problem started, as so many problems do, in Missouri. So in 1819, Missouri had enough people in it to become a state, but despite the fact that there were already more than 10,000 slaves there, a New York congressman named James Talmadge made a motion to prohibit the introduction of further slaves into the proposed state. It took almost 2 years to work out the John C. Calhoun storm that blew up after this. Actually, it took more than that. It took until the end of the Civil War, basically. But in the short run, Missouri was allowed to enter the Union as a slave state, while Maine was carved out of Massachusetts to keep the balance of things. But the Missouri Compromise also said that no state admitted above the 3630 line of latitude would be allowed to have slaves, except, of course, for Missouri itself. itself, which, as you can see, is well above the line. Anyway, this solution to westward expansion worked out magnificently, provided that you enjoy civil wars. So Thomas Jefferson, who, by the way, was still alive, which gives you some context for how young the nation truly was, wrote that the Missouri Compromise was, quote, like a fire bell in the night that awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the death knell of the Union. Eventually, almost, but in the short term, it did mean the rise of political parties. So America was becoming more democratic, but if there was only one political party, that democratic spirit had nowhere to go.
Okay, I just want to note a small short note on in regard to becoming more democratic. Yes, more white males, I know that's a shocker, were allowed to vote. So the numbers increased from about 6% around the Revolutionary War of the American population, meaning all human beings that were above the age of 21 at the time. And now more people who were white males could vote, but there were still several states that did not allow this. So we're kind of moving towards more progression and a higher level of democracy. More people do have the right to vote now, but it's still not universal in regard to even white males. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Fortunately, there was a tiny little magician named Martin Van Buren. They really did call him the Little Magician, by the way, also the Red Fox of Kinderhook, but we remember him as the worst-haired president. So despite having been president of the United States, Van Buren is arguably more important for having invented the Democratic Party. He was first to realize that national political parties could be a good thing. So I mentioned that Martin Van Buren was known as the Little Magician, and I know this sounds a little bit silly, but I think it's telling. You see, Van Buren was only the second American president with a well-used nickname, and the first was his immediate predecessor, Andrew Jackson, or Old Hickory. Why does this matter? Well, when you're actually having to campaign for office, as all presidential candidates did after the election of 1828, and you're trying to appeal to the newly enfranchised common man, what better way to seem like a regular guy than to have a nickname? I mean, if you think this is crazy, just think of the nicknames of some of our most popular presidents. Honest Abe, the Bull Moose, the Gipper. Even our lesser-known presidents had nicknames. Young Hickory, Handsome Frank, Old Rough and Ready, Big Steve. James Buchanan, and I am not making this up, was Old Public Functionary. Who are you gonna vote for? Oh, I think the Old Public Functionary. He seems competent. As it happens, he wasn't. So by now you're probably wondering, where does Andrew Jackson fit into all of this? When we last caught up with Jackson, he was winning the Battle of New Orleans shortly after the end of the War of 1812. He continued his bellicose ways, fighting Indians in Florida, although he was not actually authorized to do so, and became so popular from all of his Indian killing that he decided to run for president in 1824. The election of 1824 was very close, and it went to the House, where John Quincy Adams was eventually declared the winner, and Jackson denounced this as a corrupt bargain. So in 1828, Jackson ran a
Okay, so a couple things about what just happened. Jackson runs for president against Adams in 1824. And with some legislative stuff, Adams ends up winning. And John C. Calhoun, who was helping Adams to win, ends up becoming an important person in the government. And Jackson calls that the corrupt bargain because it's patronage, the spoils system, which I think we've already talked a little bit about. We'll talk more about that today. Basically, you can't hire people who supported you in office because that's corrupt. It's interesting where this goes. Also, the nicknames I think are really interesting because popularity is important when it comes to government officials. It's a popularity contest, and so making people less elite and more of us with nicknames is a really important way for people to start winning elections. And we see this a lot, especially with Jackson's election of 1828. We'll talk more about that in just a moment.
One of his campaign slogans was, "Vote for Andrew Jackson, who can fight, not John Quincy Adams, who can write." Adams supporters responded by arguing that having a literate president wasn't such a bad thing, and also by accusing Jackson of being a murderer, which, given his frequent habit of dueling and massacring, he sort of was. So as you can see, the quality of discourse in American political campaigns has come a long way. Anyway, Jackson won. Jackson ran as the champion of the common man, and in a way he was. I mean, he had little formal schooling, and in some ways he was the archetypal self-made man. Jackson's policies defined the new Democratic Party, which had formerly been known as the Jeffersonian Democratic Republican. So who were these new Democrats? Well, generally they tended to be lower to middle class men, usually farmers, who were suspicious of the widening gap between the rich and the poor that was one of the results of the market revolution. And they were particularly worried about bankers, merchants, and speculators who seemed to be getting rich without actually producing anything. Stop me if any of this sounds familiar. This vision probably would have carried the day, except a new party arose in response to Jackson's election: the Whigs. No, Stan, the Whigs. Yes. The American Whigs took their name from the English Whigs, who were opposed to absolute monarchy. And the American Whigs felt that Andrew Jackson was grabbing so much power for the executive branch that he was turning himself into King Andrew. So the Whigs were big supporters of the American system and its active federal government. You know, tariffs, infrastructure, etc. Their greatest support was in the Northeast, especially from businessmen and bankers who benefited from those tariffs and the stability provided by a national bank. And they also...
Quick question, what is a tariff? A tax on imported goods. And this is a really big deal. So at this time, before Jackson is elected, and most of the Jeffersonians don't like taxes in general. And we'll see how Jackson's presidency changes some things, and he makes a tax that is so insanely high that he's sure that it'll be shut down by Congress, but it passes. And we're talking up to 50%, a tax of up to 50%. So if something costs $1, you have to pay $1.50 because that tax is 50 cents on something like 92% of imported goods. This is a big deal. And if you are in the North and you're a wealthy businessman, that's great. If you're in the South and you're having trouble getting stuff to you from other states in the Union, you like imported goods because they can sail right down to your coast, and therefore all of these big tariffs are preventing British goods and other goods from coming into the South. That's hard on Southerners, and that also means that the British don't have as much money because of these tariffs, so they're not buying as much cotton, and that there are other reasons for that as well. But this is kind of really interesting. The tariffs are a really big deal.
Moral character, because that was necessary for a person to act as a truly independent citizen. So Jackson's policies must have been pretty egregious for them to spawn an entirely new political party. What did he actually do as president? Well, let's go to the thought bubble. Let's start with nullification. So in 1828, Congress passed the Tariff of 1828 because they were not yet in the habit of marketing their bills via naming them with funny acronyms. Jackson supported this in spite of the fact that it benefited manufacturers. The tariff raised prices on imported manufactured goods made of wool and iron, which enraged South Carolina because they'd put all their money into slavery and none into industry. So unlike Northerners who could avoid the higher prices by manufacturing sweaters and pants and such at home, South Carolinians would have to pay more. They were so angry at this tariff of abominations that the South Carolina legislature threatened to nullify it. Jackson didn't take kindly to this affront to federal power, but South Carolina persisted, and when Congress passed a new tariff in 1832, one that actually lowered the duties, the Palmetto State's government nullified it. Jackson responded by getting Congress to pass the Force Act, which authorized him to use the Army and Navy to collect taxes. A full-blown crisis was averted when Congress passed a new tariff in 1833 and South Carolina relented. This smelled a bit of dictatorship, armed tax collectors and all, and helped to cement Jackson's reputation as a tyrant, at least among the Whigs. And then we have the Native Americans. Much of Jackson's reputation there was based on killing them, so it's no surprise that he supported Southern states' efforts to appropriate Indian lands and make the Indians move. This support was formalized in the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which Jackson supported. The law provided funds to relocate Cherokees, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Creek, and Seminole Indians from their homes in Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, Mississippi, and Alabama. In response, these tribes adopted a novel approach and sued the government. And then the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia's actions in removing the Cherokees violated their treaties with the federal government and that they had a right to their land. To which Jackson supposedly responded by saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." So Jackson set the stage.
Okay, so John Marshall was the judge in that case, and this is part of our primary source stuff, but I just want to make sure that it's really clear that the Native Americans that were here sued the government and won, and went to the Supreme Court, won their case that said they could stay here in their land. And Jackson, the executive leader, the president of the United States, said, okay, well, the Supreme Court has made their decision, John Marshall made his decision, let him enforce it. But of course, who is in charge of the military? Who can actually enforce that? Jackson, the president. So a little bit, we're seeing like power grabs on different sides, and people, presidents in particular, this one in particular, who kind of does what he wants in some ways, and it's hard to reinforce or to stop that. But let's think about this. Who would try to stop the settlement west? Indians definitely would. Anyone else? There are some people in government who are like yelling, no, this is not cool. But who's going to put armed military against white settlers to defend brown savages, Indians? And we have that in our Constitution, yes.
Well, the primary sources then said that the first general that was told to do it protested, and he was just replaced.
Okay, so what one of our students just said was that the first general who was commanded to remove the Native Americans said, I'm done, peace out, and he left. He was very quickly replaced by a second general who was all too happy to physically and forcefully remove a lot of these tribes. Many of them just went because they knew there's no way to stop this. They are way more powerful. They have bigger guns. Literally, that's what it comes down to. And they moved peacefully. Some of the Cherokee decided not to go, and we end up with a pretty horrific result. Okay.
Cherokees from Georgia to Oklahoma, but it actually took place in the winter of 1838-1839 under Jackson's successor, Van Buren. At least 1/4 of the 18,000 Indians died on the forced march that came to be known as the Trail of Tears. Boy, Thought Bubble, you do know how to end on a downer, but thank you. But Andrew Jackson.
Just one more note, he said at least 1/4 of the 18,000 Native Americans died, so numbers are maybe a little bit different. I've seen 4,000, I've seen way more than that, so just keep that in mind. Numbers are not exactly accurate.
Jackson also changed our banking system. Just as today, banks were very important to the industrial and mercantile development of the U.S. And at the beginning of Jackson's presidency, American banking was dominated by the Second National Bank, which you'll remember had been established by Congress as part of the American system. Oh, it's time for the mystery document? The rules here are simple. When I inevitably fail to guess the author of the mystery document, I get shocked with the shock pen. The powers, privileges, and favors bestowed upon it in the original charter by increasing the value of the stock far above its par value operated as a gratuity of many millions to its stockholders. Every monopoly and all exclusive privileges are granted at the expense of the public, which ought to receive a fair equivalent. The many millions which this act proposes to bestow on the stockholders of the existing bank must come directly or indirectly out of the earnings of the American people. Stan, I know this one. It is not conceivable how the present stockholders can have any claim to the special favor of government. Should the bank's influence become concentrated, as it may under the operation of such an act as this, in the hands of a self-elected directory, will there not be cause to tremble for the purity of our elections? It is Andrew Jackson's veto of the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. Yes! So in 1832, bank leader Nicholas Biddle persuaded Congress to pass a bill extending the life of the second U.S. bank for 20 years. Jackson thought that the bank would use its money to oppose his re-election in 1836, so he vetoed that bill. In fact, the reason I knew that was from the veto message is because it talks about the bank as an instrument to subvert democracy. Jackson set himself up as a defender of the lower classes by vetoing the bank's charter. Now, Whigs took exception to the idea that the president was somehow a more democratic representative of the people than the legislature, but in the end, Jackson's view won out. He used the veto power more than any prior president, turning it into a powerful tool of policy, which it remains to this day, by the way. So the Second Bank of the U.S. expired in 1836, which meant that suddenly we had no central institution with which to control federal funds. Jackson ordered that money should be dispersed into local banks, unsurprisingly preferencing ones that were friendly to him. These so-called pet banks were another version of rewarding political supporters that Jackson liked to call rotation in office. Opponents called this tactic of awarding government offices to political favorites the spoils system. Anyway, these smaller banks proceeded to print more and more paper money because, you know, free money. Like between 1833 and 1837, the face value of banknotes in circulation rose from $10 million to $149 million, and that meant inflation. Initially, states loved all this new money that they could use to finance internal improvements, but inflation is really bad for wage workers and also eventually everyone. So all this out-of-control inflation, coupled with rampant land speculation, eventually led to an economic collapse, the Panic of 1837. The subsequent depression lasted until 1843, and Jackson's bank policy proved to be arguably the most disastrous fiscal policy in American history, which is really saying something. It also had a major effect on American politics because business-oriented Democrats became Whigs and the remaining Democrats further aligned with agrarian interests, which meant slavery. So the age of Jackson was more democratic than anything that came before, and it gave us the beginnings of modern American politics. I mean, Jackson was the first president to really expand executive power and to argue that the president is the most important democratically elected official in the country. One of the things that makes Andrew Jackson's presidency so interesting and also so problematic is that he was elected via a more democratic process, but he concentrated more power in the executive in a thoroughly undemocratic way. In the end, Andrew Jackson probably was the worst American president to end up on currency, particularly given his disastrous fiscal policies. But the age of Jackson is still important. And it's worth remembering that all that stuff in American politics started out with the expansion of democracy. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week.
Okay, so as you could see in some of that, there was a little bit of bias there in his opinion. I think in most everything that you will read, there's bias, as always, so that's nothing unusual. When we talked last unit, about Jackson's military strategies, how extraordinary he was as a military general, and the value of influence on people. And so when you win a battle, when you win a war, you become more popular. That's not surprising. And he has that nickname Old Hickory, and he does some stuff, we'll talk about that here, like politicking, where he goes out and has barbecues with people and meets people and talks to them. Familiarity is really important, which is why I have you guys do stuff like read the chapter and take quizzes before we talk about things, so that when we do talk about them in class, and when we go over the primary sources, it's familiar to you, and it should be easier to absorb this information so that you learn it better in the long run. Teacher tricks, haha, yeah. But familiarity is really important in this regard as well. It's a popularity contest. Okay, so Unit 11, we've already started, but we're going to assess and discuss the age of Jackson, and his supporters are called Jacksonians. They are kind of a continuation of Jefferson and his policies, the Jeffersonians, so we're moving forward to Jacksonians. And the time frame is approximately 1820s until 1840, though Jackson isn't president quite that long, but his influence moves forward. We'll talk about some racism, especially in the North, which is maybe surprising because the North is more abolitionist. In the South, what is a big characteristic of the South still? Slavery. Okay, so it's obvious that in the South there would, or it's not obvious, but it would make sense that in the South there would be more racism than in the North, but we'll see how that kind of happens in the North as well. And then the spoils system, nullification crisis, the national bank, all of these terms John Green, our friend, talked about in that little video. We'll talk a little bit more to make sure it's clear. And then the Indian removal of, which became the Trail of Tears, Panic of 1837, and the two-party system, the second two-party system. Any questions? Okay, so this is just kind of a review of what is happening in America, the milieu, the era, what is going on here. It's market revolution. So things are transforming. We have new technologies and a new way of life in America. So first of all, energy changes from muscle power, animals, and wind and water to fuels that can be used and disposed of. Coal, and then steam, those engines that were built, really helpful for creating higher powered stuff. What are a couple things that are made with the huge steam engines? Steamboats and trains. So we're moving faster and farther quickly with these incredible technologies. And then transportation, there we go. Trains and steamboats replace animals and watercraft. Organization, we have factories that are much bigger and more powerful than those little cottage industries when each house family would make one part of a product and pass it down to the next house. Now we have all this stuff happening in factories with bigger machines. And then urban manufacturing increases and rural agriculture declines. So less farmers, fewer farmers. We used to have like 6 out of 7 Americans were farming, and now it's like half. And women and children were always part of the workforce, but the workforce has been changing. And they are increasing numbers outside of the home, which is new for the first time. And a ton of immigrants are coming in and joining that workforce. In the early 1800s, as we just saw in that video, politics technically becomes more democratic because more white males can vote now. What is the main difference between the white males of 20 years prior and now? No, that's great. Before, you had to own land in order to be a citizen, in order to have a say. And now, more states, not all states by any means, but more states are removing that property requirement or lessening the property requirement. So if you are a white male, period, you are part of the citizenship. You are part of that sovereignty. The Constitution says that you can now vote. And because of that, this is known as the quote-unquote era of the common man, because we now, white male commoners who don't own property, can also participate, which is kind of hilarious to think about because we have half of the population that are women who have absolutely no say. We have a ton of the population in the form of Native Americans who of course have no say. And we have all of our black people, including many slaves and black free people, whose rights to vote are even being reduced over time. And then we have new political parties. We'll talk more about this in a second. So in 1819, there is a bust, an economic bust, and it turns into kind of a panic. And part of that is that there's a smaller demand for goods like cotton. The British control a huge empire across the globe, including in India. And Indians make cotton. Indian, and as in like in Asia, South Asia, Indian. They make cotton. The British stop importing. They're still importing a lot of American cotton, but the numbers are reduced. And with those huge tariffs, there's really no desire to trade with Americans. So, especially cotton, the exports are reduced, and that hurts the economy. And credit tightens. So one way that banks can control inflation or deflation is by increasing the credit rate or decreasing the credit rate. So when you can go out and get a loan for 2%, you're going to go out and get a loan for 2%. But when that rate goes up to 15%, you're going to say, wow, that's really high. I don't know if I want to get a loan where I'm going to have to pay 15% of that number back is in a fee. That's a big deal. So they tighten credit, meaning they increase the credit rate. That's painful. and a lot of banks fail. And a lot of people become bankrupt, including farmers. And then they end up going to debtor's prison. If you owe too much money, you go to jail. It's kind of interesting. We don't really do that these days. There are other ways. You become homeless and lose everything, but we don't put you in jail. And then, of course, that leads to sort of depression, because when more people don't have money, they don't have jobs, inflation increases, you can't buy food, it leads to a global depression. Global is the wrong word, United States depression. And then there's this belief that starts to really be pushed that the government should help support the people and help fix these government economic issues. It's kind of new. A couple states that did not include white males who did not own property, or North Carolina, Louisiana, Rhode Island, and Virginia. These states still said that voters are those people who own property. And interestingly, voter restrictions were increased for black men. In like the 1770s, for example, there are states that allow free black men to vote if they have some sort of property. And by the 1820s, they specifically put white on their constitutions as to who is allowed to vote. So it's becoming in some ways more restricted. Just a quick review, in the 1810s, that Federalist Party fell, and then everybody was Democratic Republicans. It was the era of good feelings, remember, one-party system. The election of 1824 was pretty contentious. Oh, I think I said John C. Calhoun earlier, but it was Henry Clay who ended up supporting John Quincy Adams, the second Adams, the first Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, yeah? And when Adams became the president, Clay was elected to Secretary of State by Adams, and that's when Jackson kind of freaked out and said, no, this is a corrupt bargain. And look at these numbers. Oh, we'll look at the numbers in a second. Yeah, so here's that image of Andrew Jackson portrayed by the Whigs. Those people who said the British, it's a kind of throw to the British who called themselves Whigs if they were opposed to a monarchy that was kind of authoritarian. And they're kind of connecting, the American Whigs are connecting Jackson with this desire to be an authoritarian king. So that's where this image comes from. The Whigs are also known as the National Republicans. Anyways, we'll look at the numbers, I guess, in a moment. So the National Republicans are Whigs, supported by a few people. They really think that a strong legislative branch, does anyone remember what the legislative branch is? We have the executive, which is the president, and the judiciary, the judicial, which is the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the House of Representatives, the Congress. So that's the legislative branch. They want a bigger, more powerful legislative branch because if you think about it, that kind of represents more people. It's more democratic, according to them. So they want an increase in East-West trade, so they push for internal improvements, like what would help promote East-West trade? Trains, yes, trains and canals. Very helpful for moving goods. So rather than taking 3 weeks or 3 months, it now takes a day or 2 days to move goods, really helpful. They don't mind higher tariffs because they want to promote American-made goods. And they think that banks are important, especially a federal bank in particular, to control monies across the United States. There's John Quincy Adams, who won that election in 1824, and by 1828 he thinks, well, I've been doing a really good job, and I'm a good person, and I'm smart, so I don't have to go out and politic. I don't have to go do the barbecues and talk to the people, which is a huge mistake on his behalf. He loses. So Jacksonians are the opposite of Adams. They want a strong executive branch. The president should have a lot of power, and his people. They like the idea of westward expansion. Why? What do they want? Land. Why? To grow cotton. Okay, maybe. For their businesses. So they can vote, and their sons can vote if they're owning property. Okay. And so they believe in the democratization of the franchise of voting rights for all white men who are, again, are considered the common man. But look at these numbers. When we see in 1824, when it says 24% of national voters turned out for the election, we're talking about the white males who were actually considered citizens and were allowed to vote. We're not talking about the huge population, but of that percentage, 24%, by the 1828 election, 80% of eligible voters went and voted. That is a huge, huge change. Humongous. More than 3 times the amount went to go vote in 1828. So the contentiousness of that 1824 election really provoked and stimulated people to go join the political thing, politics in general. So again, mudslinging, politicking, talking smack about Adams and how terrible he is. That's kind of a big deal. Barbecues, other rallies, influencing the people in that way. And it came to prove that style and propaganda, popularity based on propaganda, was way more important, bigger, than good leadership qualities. Because Adams, if you look at the 2 presidents in almost every category, from economics to politics to social status to international agreements, Adams was a much better president. But Jackson won fair and square and clean and very obviously against Adams because of how he ran his campaign. And it's kind of interesting, he catered to the population. So when he was in the South, he focuses his campaign energies on talking about how he killed so many of the Seminole Indians, who of course that's the group that supports free black people and enslaved black people who escape. They go and join Seminoles. They protect the black people. So if you're a Southerner, you don't like the idea of protecting black people because they are your property. So they're all for Jackson in that regard. And Westerners have this idea of Jackson being this like frontiersman, and he's hardy and he's strong, and he can go out, he's just like us. He wants to have his own farm, and he wants to be a strong person like we are, a common man. He doesn't really talk about the fact that his money is based on slavery, and all of his stuff that he does is run with the help of slaves. And then in the north, as far as the northern working class though, the lower class though, he says he's not an elitist. And when you look at pictures of him, he's never really dressed in uniform. He's dressed like us, like the common man. And he's always kind of strong, and has a hard stance, and he's powerful, but he's just like us. That's the image that he portrays. And it's really powerful, and it works. Oh, wow, that is really blurry. But you can kind of see here that Jackson is dressed like a normal person. He's not in like military or political uniform. He's not in a suit. He's normal. His election, I know it's a little blurry, sorry. His election in 1828 was kind of interesting in that it became a really big party, and they destroyed parts of the White House. Because he allowed everybody in. He allowed the common man to come in and party with him. He won the presidency, he was pretty excited, and he's allowed us to get drunk and go in there. Kind of interesting. This map is really interesting just because of the colors. It's so clear that Jackson won here. Just a handful of orange states voted for Adams, the National Republican, and everybody else voted for Jackson. Okay. So, yeah, I just kind of want to kind of review this part. The people who supported Jackson were the people, the common man. So farmers, planters, workers who worked hard for an honest living, they all loved Jackson because he appeared to them to be as one of them. In the North, non-slave owners, the working class, yeah. In the South, a little bit different, because most of the people, well, many of the people in the South. In the North, yeah, it was the working class that did not own slaves for the most part, or maybe owned one or two slaves, but they weren't the elitists. They weren't the big business owners. And of course, the commercial economy, the elite didn't really care for him too much. Small businesses did want his help and wanted protection from monopolies. Can anyone tell me what a monopoly is? Yeah. Yeah, owning all of the production, meaning one company or one person owns all of a certain product. And if you're a small business, monopolies are hard because they can buy stuff for cheaper, because they buy so much of it, and they can sell for cheaper, which means they get more business. It's similar to today, like Target or Amazon versus a mom and pop shop, or Home Depot versus a small interior decorating business. Amazon is just going to rule the world pretty soon, though, so maybe, maybe Disney. And then Irish immigrants of the 1840s, interestingly, supported Jackson in part because the opposition was super anti-immigrant. We'll talk about that more in just a second. And again, they're super against the aristocracy, the elitists, the bankers, the merchants, the wealthy people. And they manipulate the market for their own enrichment, which everybody does. So it's obvious that this would happen as well, even in the cases where it didn't happen. That was the belief about the wealthy elites. Okay, so the Whigs, this is the opposing party. They want, again, a more active federal government, the president. And along with all of their desire for federal funds to improve things, to make businesses within America grow, they're also strongly for both abolition and temperance, meaning anti-alcohol. So they consider themselves a more moral group of people in some ways. Okay. Most big businesses support the Whigs, and farmers who want better transportation, especially east-west, support the Whigs. And workers for economic growth want to support the Whigs. And planters who want to get loans from banks support the Whigs. And again, unfortunately for the Irish or the Catholic immigrants, these guys did not want more immigrants, so they were very anti-immigrants. And this is kind of the constituencies of the Whig Party, the people who supported Adams and Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and William Henry Harrison. Okay. And there was in some ways, some political stability with the second two-party system, which was established in full by 1840. And in some ways, it helped relieve sectional tensions over slavery because it was just simply ignored. We have the Compromise of 1820. That was one of our primary sources. What does that talk about? Compromise of 1820? Wasn't that yours? No? Compromise of 1820, wasn't that your group? Yeah? So what was that about?
It was saying that only certain places can have slaves.
Okay, so only certain states that were new to the Union could have slaves, in particular at that 36-degree line, which, entertainingly enough, Missouri was above the 36-degree line, and they had slaves, but all other states that were north of the 36-degree line would not have slaves. So this topic of slavery is kind of just put aside because it causes so much tension. We're not going to talk about that until later. And then we have a civil war, an insane civil war. Yeah, okay. So in the South, we have slavery, and in the North, when we're talking about Andrew Jackson and his policies in the age of Jackson, there's a lot of racism in the North for a lot of reasons. Obviously, black people, free and enslaved, would not want to support Jackson because his supporters were so racist against black people. And a lot of black people who were free were denied basic civil rights. There's segregation. Does anyone know what segregation means? To separate. To put in groups, yes. So black people and white people were not allowed to be in the same places together. And some of it was formal, and some of it was just normalized. It was common law, and canon, the way things were. So we're talking about on railroads or trains and steamboats and stagecoaches, and then even in places like hotels and restaurants, black people are just not allowed into these institutions, which today we obviously have a different system set up for the most part. But the black people were considered a sort of underclass, quote unquote underclass, second-class citizens or even less than. And of course, they're not considered part of Jackson's common man. They're not part of that. In some states, they could vote, but they were not allowed to sit on a jury. What do you think that means? They're not considered peers. And if I'm a black person and I'm being accused of something, and the whole jury is a bunch of white people, do you think I'm going to be considered innocent in like any case? Maybe. But the likeliness of that happening, especially if I'm accused of doing something like raping a white woman, and the jury is all white, the sympathies are probably going to go towards the white woman, and I'm going to be blamed if I'm a black male. And then some states did not even allow black people to be in their state at all, to settle. So Ohio and Indiana and Illinois are some of those states. Pretty interesting. So that the clip showed Jackson and his political patronage or spoils system, which basically meant that if you supported him, you were to receive a job when he became president. Interesting. We still see that today. So this is nothing unusual. But at the time it was unusual. It was very pronounced. The nullification crisis is what happened when, well, let's talk about this. There was a desire to protect states' rights versus the big federal powerful president. Jackson, as we talked about earlier, offered or to support this tax that was insanely high. It started low-ish. It started at like 20% in the 1810s, and then it went higher in the 1824 and 1828 to the 30-something percent. And by this time, Jackson's ideas in 1828, or right after, the Tariff of Abominations, meant a 50% tax on a lot of imported goods, which was just painful. So John C. Calhoun, who was the opposite party of Jackson, but because of voting the way the system was, he became the vice president with Jackson. And Calhoun said, you know what? Independent states have a right to autonomy, and they could reject federal law, including the tariff. And so they said, you know what, we're not going to support this, we're not going to deal with the tariff, and we're going to import stuff without paying attention. And that's when Jackson said, you know what, you can't do that, you have to listen to federal law. And he established the Force Bill in 1833, which said, if you don't support the tariff, I'm going to send the military after you. Kind of powerful. It's a big statement there. You can't go against federal law. And then Jackson's bank war. Jackson has some big challenges in his presidency, to say the least. So he vetoes the second bank for a lot of reasons. He said basically his biggest claim was that the bank supported the wealthy people at the expense of the poor people, but things kind of go the opposite of what he says. The second bank, the charter was to end, and he didn't renew, and he ordered all the $10 million in the federal bank to be dispersed to state banks. A lot of those banks were owned by his friends. That's a problem. And of course, there's not regulation or enough regulation, so we end up with tons of banknotes. Inflation increases. There's lots of counterfeiting because if there are, how many states do we have? Everyone's making their own, all state banks are making their own money. How can you tell what's a real money and what's not real money? That's a problem. And entertainingly, the wealthy commercial elite, those corporations, end up growing. And Jackson, is constantly saying how much he hates these people. So it's kind of opposite of what he says that he wants, and that ends up happening here. There's a lot of financial instability and no economic growth all the way up until really the Civil War in the 1860s. So in a lot of ways, Jackson completely ruins the national currency, and the value of the dollar, the American dollar, plummets to very, very little because we're just printing money, there's no regulation, and it's just a problem. Because if you're an investor and you're going to take out a loan, and you're going to pay your gold to take out paper money, and then that paper money ends up being worth nothing, that's a problem. So people aren't investing properly, and the whole system kind of fails. Eventually. We'll talk about that in one second. So the second bank, here's a lovely little image of the actual second bank in Philadelphia. So here's where you're talking about the specie, the money in the form of gold and silver. So in the executive order of 1836, the federal government says we're not taking or dealing with paper money. If you want to buy or do something or sell something, it has to be with physical chunk of gold or silver. So a quarter of the banks end up closing by 1837. Again, there's no big Central American federal bank, and that leads to a depression for quite some time. In the video it said till 1843, I would say till later, yes?
All my money's in paper money. I have no specie. What happened? Am I just broke?
You're broke if you have no gold or silver, yeah. If you have just paper money. Yeah, it's kind of intense. You go to your bank and you say, okay, I want my gold back, and they say, we don't have any gold. You can have more of our delicious paper money that I've just printed 10,000 more of. It's like toilet paper, literally. The gold rush happens about 10 years later, and it's in California, and it spreads to some other parts like Colorado, but that's not till the 1840s, late 1840s, 1850s. So there is some gold and some gold mining, but there's not a huge influx of gold until about 10 years later. So Jackson is on our $20 bill still, even though it's kind of ironic because he completely annihilated our federal government money, and yet here he is. Take a picture and bring it. I know this image is blurry once again, but what you can see here is that there's kind of drunken debauchery. People are just begging, standing around, don't have jobs, don't have money, can't afford to function. And this is what happened to society. Okay, Western expansion. So there are, as we know, lots and lots of treaties made with Native Americans that the US government fails to fulfill time and time again. The Western settlers, the pioneers, continuously ignore the restrictions against them, and the federal government is not willing to put military to protect Native American rights and to protect those treaties. There is trading between Native Americans and the whites, but a lot of times the Indians don't have enough to trade and end up going into debt and having to sell their land that was given to them to the Westerners to pay off their debts for those manufactured goods. So that's a problem as well. And as Indians, as the Native Americans are moving westward, they take smallpox and they spread it. So higher numbers of Indians die based on smallpox and other diseases as there's movement westward. And there are, of course, wars. One little war was the Black Hawk War of 1832. There's just lots of tension between Native Americans and settlers. Some Indians reject the idea of being forced to move west, and they fight with the Supreme Court, not physically. There are some physical skirmishes, but they use the American system to support their own rights to control their territory that has been given to them in treaties, and they win. We'll talk about that in the primary sources. But many tribes move west because they see what's been happening for 100 years now. They see that they have no chance to survive here in their homelands, and so they say, you know what, we're just going to take the money that they're giving us, we're going to take the land that they're giving us, and it's not equal, it's not dollar for dollar value. You're moving to new territory where there are other tribes. Maybe the territory is not the same type of land that you're used to. So if you are a hunter or gatherer, and maybe there's not enough food for you to hunt and gather, and you'll need to become a farmer, or vice versa. Anyways, so there are some challenges here. A lot of Native Americans, not all, but a lot of Native Americans adopt white ways of doing things. A bicameral government, meaning two branches of government, and a constitution, and many convert to Christianity, and even land use becomes very white and American, where they put fences around their property and they farm it in a similar fashion to white settlers. And they even hold slaves, which is like the most powerful of white thing that you could possibly do. If you want to become a real American, you're going to own slaves. And so they do that. And even so, nothing seems to really matter as far as their efforts goes. Jackson, president at the time, advocates the idea that Indians are on their way out. They are destined for extinction. They're going to disappear. So in a sense, his idea of promoting the Indian Removal Act is like, look, they're going to die. They're failing miserably. If we move them, then they have a chance to survive. Whether or not he actually believed that, or if that was just the talk that he used to promote his ideas, a lot of Americans agreed with him. And then gold is discovered in Georgia. And the Cherokee sue Georgia and say, we still want to keep our land. And again, we'll talk about these cases in the primary sources, but in a couple cases, in particular Worcester versus Georgia in 1835, they win. The Native Americans win, the Cherokee win, and Jackson says that he has to reinforce his win for the Cherokee, and he has to be the one to stop the settlers and stop the Georgians from kicking the Native Americans out. Well, Jackson uses this little treaty that was created with some Cherokee. There were a few leaders who went, about 500, who agreed to trade land. The remaining 17,000 were not interested in trading land, and yet everyone was forced to go because some of the people signed a treaty. There were several American government officials who disagreed with this, who said this is not right. This is not a proper treaty. Obviously, they are not representing everyone in their own group. They're representing a very, very, very small minority of the people, and yet that is what happened. And the Trail of Tears is what it was eventually called, or the Trail Where They Cried. In 1836, a lot of people, 18,000, 16,000, I'm not 100% sure of the numbers, a lot of people were physically forced out of their homes and moved west, and the best numbers that I have found say about 4,000 people died. Some people say it's more than that, up to 6,000 or so died. And the trials and the tribulations that these people went through during this trail is beyond horrific. Okay, so There were also skirmishes with Seminoles in northern Florida. And again, the Seminoles are the ones who supported free black people and enslaved black people who had escaped. And they were constantly fighting and burning down sugar plantations, and they're warring, and there's of course no clear victory as far as between the Floridians and the Seminoles and their black population. Anyways, that was 1835 to 1836, and another 10 more years. Okay, and then just a couple random facts, but I think this is kind of really interesting. In 1838, we have a lot of prohibition going on, the idea of getting rid of alcohol, getting rid of the sale of alcohol. I think I mentioned this last time, that Massachusetts, one state, decided, you know what, we're not going to allow the sale of alcohol here anymore. So one guy was really smart and painted stripes on a pig and said, you can come in and get a free glass of alcohol if you pay to see the pig, which I think is really American in a sense, because the whole idea of doing something and being an entrepreneur, like this is the epitome of entrepreneurship right here, working around creating loopholes to the system. Anyways, okay. Okay, are there any questions on Unit 11? Yes.
About the pig thing, I was thinking when you said it the first time, or when the last unit, I was like, you could just like make a circus thing, and like.
Okay, so the primary sources, there are a few questions here. So some of it is background information on the Trail of Tears, and it talks about Jackson and his policies, and it talks about what the Native Americans were doing and their lifestyle. So the first question is, in what ways did the Cherokee adapt to Western ways? Why were they still labeled savages despite their adaptations? And what was missing that could help them become civilized? So offhand, throw out some ideas here. What makes a person civilized according to white American philosophies? Owning property, being Christian. Hold on, what else? I heard a voice. Oh, they own land. All right, what else? Okay, they translated Christian Bible to Cherokee language or other languages, according to our primary source, Cherokee. What are some of the other things that make people civilized? They have laws. All peoples have laws. What are so specific about civilized laws? Okay, and what makes a person not savage? Okay. Okay, so according to the traditions of some Native American tribes that we read about in the early primary sources of this class, it talks about how they would kill people. Europeans who are very civilized and Americans who are very civilized kill people all the time. What's the difference? And we're talking about a government system and laws. There are laws in every institution, every group. What's the difference? Okay. Okay, so Europeans would maybe kill people for their country in a sense. Okay, so if we're going to kill someone, maybe it's a different person that doesn't fit in with our philosophy, but white people kill white people. There's plenty of that too. These are hard questions, I know. I'm provoking you guys a little bit. But we have laws that are written in a constitution. It's not the whim of a leader, though we just saw with Jackson how he kind of does his own thing sometimes, which a lot of our presidents do. Okay. So that's a good question. What was the Indian Removal Act of 1830? What were these two court cases? Read these. You will likely see some questions about this on the final. And then to look at the primary source excerpts, these are hard if you have not read them yet in regard to the Trail of Tears it is emotionally challenging to read this stuff. It really, if you have any sense of empathy, this will touch your heart. And it's easy to kind of think about what these people were seeing and going through. It's tough stuff. Okay. And then Andrew Jackson, in a kind of different perspective, talks about a very, in some ways, positive image of the removal of these people. And there are lots of annual messages in which he talks about the Native Americans. And we're going to focus on one big one. But in this, it talks about how it's helpful for the Native Americans, and the government is being so generous to the Native Americans, and how if you were a young white man, how grateful you would be for the money and support that these Indians are receiving to move into this new territory. How great would it be? So think about the differences between maybe the reality from the perspective of those Indians who are forced to move, and Jackson and his supporters. And he had a lot of supporters. A lot of Americans, white male citizens in particular, really liked his stuff. Okay. So go through this. I know it's kind of long, but it's easy. It's English, you know. It's not like old school. This is a lot of secondary sources. It's not, there is quotation, but it's readable, I think. Okay. Anyways, any questions? Creative means of selling whiskey. Anyone else? Any other questions?